Okay, we have just got to on the lunch break of the second day of live questioning of Peter Francis, the undercover police officer who infiltrated anti-racist groups and family justice campaigns between 1993 and 1997. He went whistleblower in 2010. I'm joined by Dave Smith, the Blacklist Support Group, who's been listening to his questioning this morning. Dave, what have you made of what we heard?
We're getting into the nitty-gritty of it now. Yesterday was all about his training and, basically hadn't left the office really, and gone into the field. Now he's actually in the field looking at actual reports that he's written while he's undercover. And, it's certainly more interesting one way or the other. It's certainly more into looking at his own reporting and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So we've seen a lot of. He started off infiltrating the Kingsway anti-fascist group, and he really talks about how it was kind of getting alongside Lewis, really, so that then he could. He was being introduced when he went along to other things. It's how he met Lois Austin from the YRE, the Youth Against Racism in Europe, and other organisers. That by being alongside Lewis, he was being introduced to people as, this is a bloke from the college. And this is a really we see this time and again with the SDS officers. It was really about them getting alongside someone who then would open doors for them.
Yeah.
And that really seemed to be how his deployment worked.
I think he described it as tangential. That in the overall scheme of things, Lewis and a relatively small little student group at Kingsway College wasn't the biggest fish in the in the pond that he was looking at. He was using them as he said, we just saw a report about Lois Austin that he wrote, and equally this is the point where it all becomes a bit, what was this intelligence exactly? And the last thing we saw was a report about Lois Austin, and he ends up having a conversation with, the discussion asked by the inquiry, how well did you know Lois Austin? Not very well at all. Hardly, I was based in Hackney. She lived in South London. Didn't really know her at all. Saw her on lots of demonstrations. What did you know about her? Well, a lot of it is basically just getting secondhand from Lewis. It's almost like, it's like just a bit of gossip. As he's said repeatedly, Lewis, loved being a bit of a name dropper and telling gossip around, and it's just like he's got that from him and writes it down.
This was really a hallmark. He reports extensively about a group called Panther UK, which he characterises as being a front group for the militant. And he said, who did you? What was the basis for your intelligence on Panther UK? And he says, one of them used to speak to Lewis, so I'd hear secondhand from Lewis intelligence about Panther UK, and that was enough to be considered coverage. He was the SDS man for Panther UK because he was alongside someone who was speaking to someone who was in Panther UK, and this was how he this is really how these reports on groups were really formulated. Sounds like a lot of secondhand hearsay.
It's third hand. It's really not a lot. Lots of incidents where he's reporting violence and people being arrested. We've just seen one on Remembrance Sunday where the National Front lay a wreath at the Cenotaph on Remembrance Sunday, which I think is absolutely appalling. Our fascists should be allowed to lay a wreath on Remembrance Sunday. It's beyond me, and has always been something that anti-fascists have campaigned against. But he talks about if there was a report, I was there and I was doing it. Okay, but the report does, mentions people being arrested, but as far as I remember, no one was charged for anything like that. But nonetheless, it's
I looked into this thing, but why did the National Front lay a wreath on Remembrance Sunday, seeing their side lost? The official position is that no more brothers' wars. That Britain was on the wrong side of the Second World War. In fact, Britain should have united with Hitler, and they're laying a wreath as about the tragedy of the fact that we fought the wrong enemy. Apparently, we should have been fighting the Russians with Hitler. Apparently, appalling. Yeah, and we heard a lot about Welling, which is the October '93 demonstration against Welling, which was Peter Francis's first deployment, really, a large demonstration. He talked about how he said that he's unable to remember details of public demonstrations because of his PTSD. But he talks about how after the demonstration, he, along with all the other SDS officers, spent many hours going through the helicopter video footage, other CCTV footage, camera stills images, to identify people. And he says that HN78, Trevor Morris, the black undercover officer we heard from back last year, really cleaned up that day. That he swept up a lot of people he'd been very close to, who he was able to identify as being somehow involved in disorder at that Welling demonstration. And this role, I think, it's an overlooked aspect of what the SDS officers did. As much as they were in the field with activists, they also spent a huge amount of time behind closed doors in the SDS, going through video footage to identify people.
Yeah, and the bit that didn't really square, the way the circle wasn't really squared for me was when he was talking about, he kept being asked on some of the reports about, how did you know this person was violent? How did you know this individuals are violent? And he kept saying, well, I must have seen it, or it was well known and that kind of stuff. And he said there were lots of people that I would have liked to have scooped up. Well, if they looked at Francis himself says that I looked at police photographs after events to say, well, if we were all that violent and if we were all doing that, and you were looking at photographs after, why weren't we all arrested? Why weren't we all sent? So why weren't we all sent to prison for all this terrible violence that was happening every other week, or every other day by the sounds of it. I want to slightly go back to Welling as well, because one of the reports Welling was about a meeting of activists that Francis reported on, where there was discussion that because of the violence by police at Welling, a number of the protesters got injured. And Francis talks about, earlier on, Francis was asked, was there any violence at demonstrations? And Francis says, yes, there was. I was involved in quite a lot. Most of it was from the police. The police would hit demonstrators on the head with truncheons, so it's going back. There was a meeting after Welling that Francis reports on, where the discussion was, should the stewards have hard hats or not, in order to and I'll be honest, I was a steward at Welling. I was right at the front when they blocked the road. There was literally nowhere to go. We were walking up, and it was just basically it was a trap, and there was lots of violence there, and it was meted out by the police. But I was there with lots of construction workers, and the police in the run up to Welling were telling everybody it was going to be a riot. All police leave had been cancelled, so we brought dozens of hard hats, and all of our stewarding contingent all wore hard hats, and quite honestly, it saved my skull that day, because I was battered on the head on multiple occasions on that day by police truncheons. And if we hadn't taken stewarding seriously, and if we hadn't made preparations to defend ourselves, whether it be from the police or from fascists, then there would have been lives lost on that day. And I think I'm never going to apologise for defending a march, and I'm never going to apologise for making preparations to defend a march, because we should. It's when it's done all a bit ad hoc and we'll defend it spontaneous. That's the bit that I think we need to. Very rarely do things happen spontaneously. Most of the time, there's a degree of organisation that needs to take place, and I'm as a trade union organiser, that's my job. That's my role.
Yeah, no, absolutely, fair enough. And we heard as well about the visit of the Commissioner, Paul Condon, to the SDS Safe House on the aftermath of the Welling demonstration, about how he brought them a bottle of whiskey and thanked the SDS officers for the success of the Welling demonstration. And it was clear to him that there was no record of this. And perhaps he got it confused with a March 1995 visit of Paul Condon to the SDS Safe House. And Peter Francis said, I didn't think I was allowed to talk about that. because that was a commendation for one of the officers in the other area that I'm not allowed to talk about. This is the officers who we don't even have a cipher for, so high is their secrecy. They work in the other area, which I think anybody who's been following closely can guess what the other area is. I'm loath to actually mention it because it would suggest that I'm about to break a restriction order, but I think anybody can guess what the other area is. They said that was a separate visit, that was a visit all about one particular individual officer and him getting a commendation for the work that he had done. But the first visit was about all of the SDS officers, and he had been the new boy, he'd been the latest one to go out in the field, so he remembers specifically that HN86 had introduced him. But that second visit, David Barr asked a very pointed question, which I thought was very strange. He said, I can't ask you about that in any detail, but I just asked one very pointed question, and I just want a simple answer, don't go into any detail. Was it a white officer? To which he said, yes. To which then David Barr turned to the chair and said, I don't think I should go any further. And Mitty went, no, you shouldn't go any further. I really feel this was a strange question for David Barr to ask. And I felt like it signaled just to those watching what that other area might well be. There have been a lot of these little references. We've had a few breaches. I can't say what the breaches were about, but there's a few things that Peter Francis has said that you can tell he is being frustrated by the fact that he's not allowed to talk about a big area of what he wants to whistleblow about that the SDS was doing at that time.
Yeah, of course. He's not allowed to say it in this hearing, as I understand it. I mean, if you know information, the restriction orders are you're not allowed to, disclose information that you find during the process of this hearing, or is disclosed in this process. I mean, if you know it outside the hearing, you're well within the rights to come and talk about it. The restriction orders don't, apply to you. I mean, you might be more inclined to say it in the witness box when you can't be sued for libel, but that's a different ball game altogether. One thing that Peter Francis was very, very insistent in challenging was some of the evidence from Lewis, who gave evidence a couple of weeks ago, which ended up being splashed all over the newspapers. And he really wanted to put the record straight on that. And it's sort of. We had about 5 minutes on this where he sort of really wanted to hammer home the point that he'd never been into heavy metal music and he'd never worn a black leather biker's jacket. And when I first thought he was overplaying it, but I then Googled the press from last week, and one of the headlines was long-haired student in heavy metal t-shirt was undercover copper, so it's clearly annoyed him. So
I mean,
the big issues are coming out here.
yeah, quite. Yeah, he was very adamant about that. I mean, he said that the reason he didn't wear a leather jacket was because he'd been advised by some of the animals, by which he meant SDS officers who infiltrate animal rights, that wearing leather was a bad idea, in case he was ever able to infiltrate the M11 campaign, which was one of the groups he was initially targeted on. And we were shown his targeting document as well, which, I mean, that was early on today, but like that was he was kind of quizzed about the fact that it was just about anti-racist groups. There was no mention of family justice campaigns, and he said they were very general, and that you wouldn't necessarily put everything in writing. In fact, as a unit, the SDS, particularly the old school members of the SDS, preferred to keep things just orally, not in writing at all. But he also talked about a huge number of his reports that were missing from what we've seen.
Yeah, it's also the very fact that he's going in 93, I think, 93, and it's at the time when the rise of the BNP in Combat 18, BNP electorally, Combat 18, street fighting, and some BNP street fighting as well. And yet it's all about, his entire, deployment strategy, his target strategy is all about the fact that the far left who are doing a counter demonstration against the BNP, the far left who are, protest against, or do a memorial because, the Nazis have put some young poor Asian kid, Kadis Ali, into a coma in Whitechapel Hospital. The people we need to spy on are the left rather than the actual people who are going around committing political violence, and terrorising entire communities. it's a more general point.
No, I mean, I think it's a really important one. I mean, we saw repeatedly from his reports of him characterising groups like Youth Against Racism in Europe as violent. Panther UK, again, a group he had no actual penetration of, describing them as violent. And it shows that he didn't have much to base that on. I mean, he deployed as an undercover officer through enrolment in Kingsway College in the September of '93. Within a couple of weeks, he's on the Welling demonstration, and he's publishing these reports in the aftermath of that. Basically, if you were a group who was at the Welling demonstration, he's characterizes you as violent because you went to a demonstration where the police attacked the crowd. Essentially, that's the qualification that is the basis for all these groups being described as violent.
Yeah, completely. Were you ever involved in protests that were violent? Yes, quite a lot. We were often attacked by the police, or attacked by fascists, and in those cases you defend yourself. I think it's a. I think that conversation's been had.
Yeah, no, we just before lunch, we were just being taken to some anonymised SDS reports. But Peter Francis said, look, we've been looking at demonstrations. I did say that I found that very stressful. Can we have an early lunch? So we broke 10 minutes early for lunch. But that doesn't mean that when we go back, we'll be looking at those anonymised SDS reports. I don't know if that means that it's going to be in reference to the officers from the restricted area or not. That wasn't very clear, but we should be seeing a lot more of his reports. He claims lots of them are missing, particularly his negative reports. That was ones where he claimed he reported that people weren't involved in things or hadn't done things, but those are completely missing from the record. But is there anything you're looking forward to hearing about this afternoon?
No.
Fair enough. Well, we're going to have some lunch. Thanks for joining us. I will be doing another one of these videos in the break this afternoon and at the end of the day.
I'm interested when he's going to talk about blacklisting, though, because his witness statement's got some very interesting points about blacklisting, much more than some of the other police officers. And the thing is that what's very, very obvious, the reason we're interested in that is what's very obvious is anytime one of the activists gets interviewed, they are questions like, they have 100 questions, 200 questions about violence. Were you violent? Were you ever violent? Did you see anyone being violent? Did you ever advocate violence? All that kind of stuff. Whereas when it comes to asking the police about blacklisting, they ask them one question: do you know anything about blacklisting? No. Okay, let's move on. It's like, for God's sake, I mean, the difference between their, they weren't just gathering information out of curiosity. Special branch files didn't just gather dust on in a filing cabinet or on an electronic database. This information was used for something, and one of the key things it was used for was stopping people on the left getting jobs. They call it vetting, but it's just a sanitised word for blacklisting. And they, anyone who's had any time in special branch or at senior levels in the Metropolitan Police knows all about this, but they barely ever get a question about it at all. And that's why I'm hoping that, because Francis is one of the few witness statements actually mentions it in more than just like, one or two sentences, that they do some actual proper questioning on that as well.
Yeah, we look forward to that. He is giving evidence all week. It's meant to be finishing on Thursday. There is a rumour it might run till Friday. So we might have 5 days of questioning, which... how lucky we are. Okay, we're going to get some lunch. Thanks for joining us. See you all in a bit.